It's hard to think of a parliamentary institution that's less understood and more criticized, even vilified, than the Senate of Canada. It was created by the Fathers of Confederation a century and a half ago as a check on the power of the elected House of Commons. But more often than not, it's been a place where prime ministers reward the party faithful with a job till age 75. Back in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau changed the way senators are appointed to a so-called nonpartisan, merit-based process. More than half the senators are now neither Liberal nor Conservative, but members of a so-called independent senators group. Question: is the Senate now any better, more legitimate, or better accepted by Canadians? Let's find out. We welcome to our studio Senator Frances Lankin from the Independent Senators Group. In Montreal, Quebec, Senator Leo Housakos from the Conservative Party of Canada. And in Sudbury, Ontario, via Skype, Nadia Varelli. She's a professor of political science at Laurentian University, and we are delighted to welcome you three to our program tonight. We want to do a few things of housekeeping off the top. Full disclosure. Do you have a policy advisor that I need to know about?
Yeah, you should. I probably didn't tell you at the beginning, but I hired one of your sons.
Okay, there we go. Henry Paikin works for Senator Frances Lankin, so we get that on the table in the interest of full disclosure. I went to the new Senate digs in Ottawa over the weekend and got some pictures, which we're going to put up right now. The one behind us is one. Here are some others. You know, of course, Parliament's being renovated for the next decade, maybe two, and as a result, you senators have had to move to new digs. This is the old railway station, the Government Conference Centre, and they've actually, I have to say, done a beautiful job trying to make these new digs for you. Well, they're not going to be as historically glorious as the old digs, but they've done a pretty darn good job with the new Senate headquarters. So that's them. And now that we have all of that done, let's talk about the way things work right now. And Senator Lankin, we'll go to you first. You are part of this new group that is sort of neither Liberal nor Conservative. It is more nonpartisan. You were appointed from a list vetted by an independent committee as opposed to just, chosen by the Prime Minister. So far, we're 3.5 years into this new process. In your view, better way to do business?
I think there have been some improvements, some which started before the change in appointment process or the independent senators started to arrive, some which have happened since. I think that there is hope for improvement. I think there's a long way to go. I think it's been very slow and purposefully slow from the point of view of the opposition, and there's lots to be talked about within that. But I see improvements and I'm hopeful. I just want to challenge one thing in your intro.
Please.
You said so-called independent senators group. Now, my colleague, Senator Housakos, might say that, but it is called the Independent Senators Group, and there are people from a variety of perspectives, some of them political along the spectrum, with past partisanship, and others that are not partisan at all. So it's a real interesting mixture of people.
And your point is, it is a genuinely independent group as opposed to a so-called independent group.
Absolutely.
Okay. Senator Housakos, it sounds like Senator Lankin thinks that your approach to this new arrangement in the Senate is part of the problem as opposed to the solution. What's your view on it?
Well, I believe that nothing has really changed in the Senate since 2015. We have a prime minister that continues to appoint senators, as every previous prime minister has done in the past. The fact that he has set up a vetting committee in order to vet those candidates and has turned this into a public exercise, which I think has become a bit of a fiasco, because at the end of the day, every prime minister vetted their appointments. Some did it internally, some did it within the confines of the Privy Council when they did their vetting process. And every prime minister has made partisan appointments and nonpartisan appointments, and every prime minister has tried to make sure their appointments are representative of various walks of life and people with various skill sets. And this prime minister has done the same. And I have absolutely no conflict whatsoever with the appointments he has made. They're great appointments. Senator Frances Lankin is a very politically partisan appointment in itself. She has a long history in politics, a distinguished career at the provincial level of politics, and a very worthy advocate for the province of Ontario in the upper chamber.
But her previous political experience is not in the same party as the Prime Minister's.
No, it's not. And there's other, and indeed the Prime Minister has named a variety of people from a variety of political backgrounds, but as we all know, each and every one of those appointments are very much left of center political-minded people. He hasn't named right of center conservative-minded people, and that's also legitimate and it's normal. The current government is going to name senators that defend and support their agenda and their policy. And of course, the proof is always in the pudding. The 49 or so appointed senators by Mr. Trudeau, these so-called independent senators, 96% of the time vote in favor of government legislation.
Okay, we're going to get to that in a second.
All the time, they articulate in favor of government.
We'll pluck that apart a little more as we go along. I almost put you in the Senate, Senator Varela. I should say, Professor Varela, do you want to weigh in on the new means of appointing senators and what your take on it is?
I think it's a lot better than the other senator is implying. Yes, left to center, right to center. I think the key is the process seems to be more open. It's more transparent. And I think that's important when we're talking about legitimizing the Senate. And as well, what we're seeing, and I know we're getting to it later, but what we're seeing, they may approve government bills, but it's not partisanship. And I think that's what's key with this new Senate.
Let's just show what the standings are in the new Senate, because, of course, over the last 3.5 years that Prime Minister Trudeau has appointed senators to a new independent senators group, it's really changed the flavor of the way the Senate was, certainly when Prime Minister Harper was in charge. The independent senators group now has the largest number in the Senate, 58 senators. The Conservative Party of Canada has 31. The Liberal Party of Canada, and these were people appointed as Liberals and who chose not to join the independent Senate group, they still sit as Liberals. There's 9, and then completely unaffiliated is 7, for a total of 105. Now, can we follow up, Senator Lankin, on what your colleague just said a second ago, which was that these senators that the Prime Minister has appointed sitting as an independent senators group may not be big L Liberals, but in his view, they're small L Liberals, and they vote in the interests of the current government. Fair or not?
I want to take that in 2 parts.
Sure.
The first part of that, I think, is absolutely fair. The majority, not all, but the majority of the appointments have been not left of center, but center to center left, I would say. I'm probably the furthest left in terms of my small p political views and political values and social policy values. But the fact that that means they support the government legislation is absolutely untrue. And Senator Housakos will continue to point to vote records. If you went back and analyzed the vote records before ISG senators started to arrive and looked at how the Conservatives voted in this period of time where they were not in government, they in fact supported the majority of the legislation at the end of the day.
I got that right here.
Oh, do you?
Let's put the numbers up.
And if we go back, yeah, please.
Okay,
And if you
let's
go
put the
back
numbers
before
up.
that, the Liberals did the same. And they managed to support
Okay, here we
government
go.
legislation in votes.
This is now. We've got 2 different categories here. A lot of people listen to this on podcasts, so I'm going to read this out in some detail because they can't see these graphs. From 1980 to 2015, a period of time, incidentally, when the Liberals were in power about half the time, the Conservatives in power about half the time, there were 1,700 government bills that went through the Senate, and only 3 were rejected. And from 2011 to 2015, there was only 1 government bill that got amended. So I think we do need to put that to Senator Housakos, which it sounds like when the Conservatives had the majority in the Senate, they weren't much of a check on the House of Commons any more than the current ISG is on the current government. Fair to say?
No, not fair to say at all. And let me point out a couple of things.
Sure.
Number one and foremost, we all understand as senators, we're a chamber of sober second thought. We understand the elected legitimacy of the House of Commons, and we also understand we are a democracy fundamentally, and that's where the challenges are for the Senate. So we have an obligation and a responsibility to be very respectful when it comes to that. But there's a lot more than just legislation. There comes a point in time when you have a majority of senators that are representative of the government, which we currently have, and they have the added value of being appointed by this Prime Minister as independent senators. So when you have a number of Aboriginal senators during the marijuana debate get up and make very compelling speeches about how this is hurtful to their communities and how the Aboriginal communities cannot sustain and support the legalization of marijuana. And they made, like I said, compelling, very outstanding speeches in the chamber on behalf of the communities which we are appointed to represent. And each and every one of them fell in line and supported that legislation. As senators, we know the only time we defeat government legislation is when it is so egregious to the community, the provinces we represent. And we've seen time and time again a number of Trudeau-appointed senators get up and rip their shirts in indignation about a particular piece of legislation that is important to their constituency or the people they represent, and they just tumble over and vote for the legislation.
Okay, let me get Francis Lankin to comment on that part of your argument. Go ahead.
Well, again, I invite you to go back and look at the record prior to the Independent Senators Group forming and being there. And quite frankly, I mean, one of the first votes when I did arrive at the beginning that I watched on a budget bill, half the Conservatives voted in favor of the budget and half abstained to make a political point. But the whip had done a very fine job and counted the votes, shared with the other side, and made sure that it passed. They did that all the time. And so, by the way, did the Liberals when the Conservatives were in government. If you look further to the kind of amendments that have been debated and discussed, you will see there's a much more active, exploration of these things. And I think at the end of the day, what Senator Housakos said at the beginning in terms of we understand our role as senators, which is not to compete with the elected House of Commons, but to improve bills, to ensure that on constitutional compliance, charter compliance, regional impacts, minority, Indigenous impacts, that we take those things into particular account. And at the end of the day, we may send amendments over. It's going to be still a rare occasion for the Senate to reject an elected majority government's piece of legislation, most particularly when it was part of their election campaign. Those are the conventions that we work by. And if there's whipping of caucuses in a non-caucus group where people can vote where they want, we have to keep that in mind and bear witness to that as our jobs.
Nadia Varelli, let me get you to weigh in on this discussion happening between these two senators.
I think we need to broaden our understanding of sober second thought. For me, it's not just whether or not the Senate passes the bill or rejects the bill. Sober second thought is about giving deep consideration to what the House of Commons is doing. And this is what one of the original intents of the Senate was. And I think with this new Senate, especially with the Independent Senators Group, we are seeing a more thorough revision or a thorough look at bills. So you had that one statistic up where between 2011 and 2015, the Senate only recommended an amendment for one bill. Well, between 2015 and 2018, they've recommended 14 amendments for 14 bills. Now, to be clear, not all of them are substantial amendments, but what we're seeing more and more is that the Senate is not afraid to challenge what government is doing. So yes, they may be voting along government lines or voting for government bills, but I do think what we're seeing is the Senate pushing back. We definitely saw that with S3. We definitely saw that with the cannabis bill. We're seeing this now with what's the new environmental impact
C-69.
Bill. C-69, thank you. So we're seeing the Senate just conducting more thorough investigation, a thorough look at the bills. And I think that's what we need to accept or expect from the Senate, not whether or not they're, passing bills.
Senator,
what I'm seeing less of is the rubber stamping.
Senator Housakos, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, listen, the fact that there's been more amendments and unsubstantive amendments going back to the House of Commons, which by and large, most of them have been refused by the government, is not enough. The only reason we've had a number of these amendments going back is because in this new model that Prime Minister Trudeau has imposed on the Senate, senators that he has named to the Senate of Canada no longer have a voice in the national caucus of the government, which is a substantive role for senators. Senators represent their regions. They represent minorities. They represent Aboriginal groups. Senators, for example, in the Montreal region during the Harper government, when we did not have elected Conservatives and have a voice at the National Caucus, were that voice. Today, Trudeau-appointed senators are no longer a voice of their region to the government, to their caucus. And that's where you can make changes to legislation before ministers even bring that legislation to the floor of the House of Commons. That's a lot of the substantive work which senators used to do, both Liberals and Conservatives, which no longer the Trudeau-appointed senators are able to do. If you're a Trudeau-appointed senator from Saskatchewan, what's the point if he cannot have that voice, for example, articulated in National Caucus, where the Liberals hold only one of 14 seats? That is a huge role of the Senate, which the forefathers had put into place to be a voice for minority voices in this country where democracy fails because we are such a vast regional country. And Mr. Trudeau's reform fails in large part when it comes to allowing those voices to be heard in the governing caucus.
Okay, if there's one thing this discussion has amplified, it's the fact that we have two very different approaches happening right here. We have the sort of more traditional partisan approach taken by Senator Housakos and the Conservatives. They are all political people with a capital P political, as opposed to Senator Link and your group, which is a more, as you describe it, independent group, less partisan, trying to act more like a council of elders advising, as opposed to a partisan wing of the government of the day getting its program through. If these two very different approaches are going head into head against each other like this, I guess people are wondering, does that make the Senate not very effective? What's your view on that?
I think there's lots of days that the Senate is not effective at all, and I distress about that. Now, I've been in partisan politics, as you know, and
We should just say, because a lot of people are new Canadians who don't know, you were a cabinet minister in the NDP government from 1990 to 1995, so this is a long time ago, but that's how you started in politics.
Absolutely. And I remember through that time being, one of a group of the architects of some of the most noteworthy filibusters that ever took place in the Ontario legislature. So I get it and I understand it, but I think that happens in the House of Commons and it happens very well. And I think that, where we're at now, we see certain dilatory use of rules by opposition, which is in fine tradition, of historical tradition, but at points in time that, it really is all about what's going on in the House of Commons and about writing the script for the next election. It's not about sober second thought at all.
And you think it should be?
I think it should be. I think that it is important, and I've said this publicly, back to Senator Housakos' point about the majority. Again, I want to stress not all, but the majority of the appointments have been center to center left. I have said that as this process continues, there needs to be a balancing. We need to get to a point where it's not just the Conservative caucus that embodies the principles of conservative thinking in this country. There's
You'd
a
like
spectrum
some of that in
thinking.
the Independent Senate group too.
More, we have some, but I'd like more. But, in the end of the day, it's not that we need a group to do that. What we need is a Senate that talks to each other. There are multiple meetings that are held with different experts coming in on bills and counterpoints of view and everything, which we invite Conservative senators to come. There's one or two that come sometimes, the rest of the time not. When there's the symposium for the IRPP report that came out recently that the professor was part of.
20 seconds of background here. This is the Institute for Research on Public Policy, which did a report, convened a conference to talk about some of the changes that have gone on in the Senate.
Right.
And that's what you're referring to there.
Referring to that and referring to the fact that there was a request for a Conservative senator to participate. That was rejected. They have isolated themselves and not participating in some of the meatier questions about what a future Senate could look like and how do we bring more value to Canadians. And I hear lots of speeches where they say, Canadians want on bills. Well, Canadians want, according to public opinion polling, a less partisan Senate, but it doesn't seem to hold water in the debates.
Okay, Senator Housakos, your turn.
Look, less partisan Senate for Justin Trudeau and his appointees is code for we don't want anybody who opposes our legislation or holds our government to account. The Senate is a body which, in large part, in addition to its legislative work, is a parliamentary body. It is part and parcel of our Westminster system. It has an important role in holding the government to account. We've seen recently the public wants more information on this SNC scandal and the role the Prime Minister's office played in it, for example. And now we leave it to the House of Commons, which is under a majority government, iron-fisted control. And we have a Justice Committee over on that side that is controlling what witnesses show up, when they show up, how long they can speak, when they won't be allowed to speak. And this is, again, part and parcel of our parliamentary system where the Senate has a role to play in holding a government to account. And we have put forward a motion now before the Senate of Canada in order to fulfill a void that the House of Commons cannot fill because of the majority grip that the government has. And every single Trudeau-appointed senator has refused to allow us to send this particular inquiry, which the Canadian public, the Canadian media want answers to to a Senate Justice Committee in order to do a more thorough inquiry, for example. Senator Lankin will say that, Senator Housakos, you're being partisan. No, we're doing our jobs as parliamentarians, which is holding the government to account and trying to get answers which Canadians are entitled to. Every single time that a parliamentarian in the Senate from any side questions the government, votes against the government, or asks the government to be accountable, the Trudeau-appointed senators rush to their defense. And they call that partisanship. No, it's called democracy, and it's called a parliamentary democracy.
Okay, let me get Nadia Varelli to break the tie here. Again, we've got one side playing sort of old-fashioned brass knuckles politics in a partisan sense, the traditional role of the Senate. We've got a different side trying to take a new sort of Council of Elders approach, which in their view is less partisan. Nadia Varelli, how effective can the Senate be when you've got such large groups playing by apparently different rules?
I just want to say, I think it's quite rich what's going on now, accusing the current government covering up or not allowing the further investigation with the SNC Lavalin, when under the Stephen Harper government, we had a very similar scandal going on with the PMO and it overstepping with the Mike Duffy thing and whatnot. That said, I think with regards to the effectiveness of the Senate, I don't think we're there yet, but I do think we're one step closer. This vetting process, I think it's promising. And when we talk about holding government to account, I think it's fundamentally different than the Legislative Assembly holding government to account. The role of the Senate has always been to ensure that the regions continue to have a voice at the center. And this, I think, is what the Senate needs to do. So it's not necessarily questioning what government is doing, but ensuring that the different regional voices are present when the government is acting in the interest of the nation. I'm not saying that we're there yet, but we're one step closer than we were when, Pierre Trudeau made his large appointment right before he retired, or when Stephen Harper appointed a large block of Conservative senators. I think the system is not perfect, but it's better than what we've had in the past. And I think we can only build on this.
Well, let me follow up on that with Senator Lankin, because now that you're not whipped to vote a certain way by the Prime Minister's office, one of the things that the IRPP report reflected is that you're getting lobbied more individually as independent senators. And I guess some people will ask whether or not that's a positive development. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's a lot of government relations consultants that are getting rich on this move. But beyond that, I think hearing from stakeholders is important, but it's not all that politicians do. And I think that, politicians in the House of Commons represent their regions very well. It's my attempt to really debate a point with Senator Housakos that I'd like to get into. But I think in the case of the IRPP report, it questioned whether or not that meant people were going to become captive. Well, I can tell you, the C-69 is a good example. The broad range of people who are lobbying, bringing, Indigenous voices, environmental voices, industry voices from the oil patch, from the mining sector. They're very different points of view. And so I don't see that as a negative thing, other than sometimes there's too much. And, I know other senators have taken a position that we hear from a variety of perspectives. And then once it gets to committee, we work with colleagues around the table to listen and to talk about what those points of view mean for the legislation or not.
Senator Housakos, let me follow up with you on this front. Whether you think that the new independent group are too center-left or too much in the pocket of the Prime Minister, as you would put it, the fact is that their backgrounds are quite varied, and they don't come from politics, most of them. They come from a wide variety of other occupations and backgrounds. Unlike, say, the previous group of senators who've been appointed in the past 147 years, most of whom have some partisan affiliation with the party in power. Is that a positive development in your view?
Well, I'd be happy to answer that question, but I want to go back to the good professor's comment a little bit earlier regarding how rich it was to make the comment about having accountability with this government in the Senate compared to the Harper government. I just want to point out that during the Duffy scandal, it was Prime Minister Harper who waived privilege on his chief of staff. It was Prime Minister Harper and the Conservative majority Senate that brought in the Auditor General for a full forensic audit of the Senate. It was a Conservative-dominated majority Senate that sent files to the RCMP, and today Mike Duffy is sitting as a member of the ISG group embracing this new Trudeau reform. So I want to be clear about that. In terms of your question, Mr. Paikin, I think it's important to understand, if you look at Mr. Harper's appointments, and I can only speak to those because I've been in the Senate only since that period of time, many of his appointments were nonpartisan appointments. Many of them, professors, deans of universities, doctors, hockey coaches that came from walks of life who never held a progressive conservative membership card. So did they represent his particular view of the world? Did they support the agenda of the government? Absolutely. But to say that Stephen Harper, and for that matter, even Jean Chrétien, I'll go back to Prime Minister Chrétien, that they made only partisanship appointments, it's very unfair. Prime Minister Chrétien named a number of conservatives to the upper chamber while he was prime minister. So, and I believe that it's completely unfair to say that all of a sudden Mr. Trudeau has invented the whole notion of independence, where if you look at in practice, independence for this government simply means when you support the government. When you oppose it, question it, they do it in the House of Commons. Whenever the opposition questions an issue in the House of Commons, their quick comeback response always is, you guys are being partisan. Well, in a democracy and political discourse, partisanship is part and parcel of the discussions in the process, and there's nothing wrong with it. What's wrong with it is when you are not transparent, when you pretend you're not a liberal, but you are a liberal, when you pretend you're not a socialist, but you are a socialist, when you pretend...
with just a few minutes left here, let me put that directly to Francis Lankin. You you don't sit in a formal partisan caucus in the way that Senator Housakos does, but your independent senators do gather and meet, right?
Yes.
Is it very similar to like when you sat as a New Democrat in a party caucus? Do you operate the same way?
Only in part. There's no whip. There is no attempt to come to a consensus on a bill. There's an attempt to share information, deepen knowledge, develop your own opinions from review, discuss it with each other, but we don't take it the next step. There's no ordering how to vote or when to be there. What we do agree on, and there's a former charter that has been published that you can look at. What we do attempt to agree on is reform of the Senate. So issues, operational, administrative issues, we try to come to an agreement around that of what the majority there can support. I think that, Senator Housakos.
Leo works, Francis.
Yeah, I know. Thanks. I think that when we go to his argument about partisanship as a fundamental part of democracy, I agree completely. I don't question that. I think the Senate could work better as a less partisan group, with all of the views being explored, with the view of working together in interest of Canadians and not in the interest of the caucus that you sit with. I don't buy the argument, by the way, that you had influence before the bill, and you talk about lack of transparency then, and did nothing in the Senate as a result of it. Well, run for elected office and sit in the caucus and have your regional influence there. I think MPs would be very offended to suggest they don't bring their regional interests to the table.
With just a couple of minutes left, Senator Housakos, can you tell us, if the Conservatives win the federal election in October, you think Prime Minister Scheer, as he then would be, will return to appointing senators the old-fashioned way as opposed to picking up and doing it the way it's currently done?
Prime Minister Scheer respects the Constitution. He recognizes there's only one way in order to put forward a Senate reform, and that's to do it constitutionally and through constitutional discussions. What Prime Minister Trudeau is engaging in right now is nothing more than demagoguery. It was a political...
Okay, no, I need to hang on. With time running out, I need a direct answer to this. Will will future Prime Minister Scheer return to the old way of appointing senators?
Scheer will appoint senators like every other prime minister has. It's his prerogative to do it. Mr. Trudeau's doing it.
But will they be vetted by an independent committee the way they are now?
I'm sure he will have some committee in place. It's for the prime minister to determine what process he wants to use to name those senators.
He has said publicly he will return to the old way.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to get confirmation of that. Nadia Varelli, you get the last word on this today. Where do you see the Senate going, given what's possibly going to happen in October?
I think if our goal is to render the Senate legitimate, then we need to be transparent in how we appoint senators. We need to be transparent, or the Senate needs to be transparent. The fact that they're televising their proceedings now, I think this is a great move when we're talking about democracy. And when I talk about democracy, I'm not talking about partisanship. I'm talking about open deliberation, the ability to voice dissent, the ability to discuss. And I think if we want to return to a Senate that is legitimate in the eyes of the public, transparency is the way to go. And it starts with the appointment process.
Well, I thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and having a sober second look at how the Senate is doing nowadays. Senator Frances Lankin
Thank you.
from the Independent Senators Group here in our studio in Toronto. Senator Leo Housakis from the Conservative Party of Canada joined us from Montreal, and Professor Nadia Varelli from Laurentian University joining us in Sudbury tonight. Thanks so much, you three.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.